we go, Reaver Titan. We are building number 2573. So let's have a look at where we're at so far. Instructions for this thing are pretty sparse. There's about 6 pages of instructions. It's a bit of, it's a case of, you know, the more you can look online, the better prepared you'll be for it, because there's a lot of areas where you can really get it wrong early on. So the first thing that I would suggest is definitely to build the torso first. Build this thing first. The back section is the first section to build. There's 3 parts, 1, 2, 3. That are the big parts. These are heavy. This is a solid chunk of resin. Now, the way to attach it, the way to glue is with, there's a couple of products, but the one that you see online the most is a product called JB Weld. I haven't been able to find it at my hardware store, but there's loads of products that do the same thing. This one is a Gorilla product, which works really well. It's exactly the same stuff. It's like a cold weld. It's called Gorilla Weld. It's an epoxy hardener. So it holds about 150 kilos, I think is what this is rated to. So it's more than enough to handle the resin involved in this thing. Even so, I have pinned it through the back here. So through this back section here, there is 2 3mm brass rods just holding it together. So yeah, you drill that with, and you can see there's some resin dust on here. You've got to be careful of this stuff. Before we go any further, I would say that when you're working with this stuff, it is nasty. This resin stuff is nasty. It is carcinogenic. You definitely want to be wearing a mask. Yeah, especially if you're sanding it or drilling it or really anything. So like I said, first step, pin it, glue it with this, with the 2-part epoxy, and clamp it together. So you can use rubber bands, you can use zip ties, you can use a large clamp, which is what I've used. It'll be strong enough within sort of 10 minutes, but full hardening time is about 4 hours. You want to leave it for about 24 hours before you go any further. This section slots together. This is pretty easy. You can do this bit with the instructions that they've given you, pretty straightforward. The only thing that I've done differently is I haven't fitted the crew compartment in here because I want to build a separate diorama for that. I don't want to be, I know that I'm never going to take this off and have a look at what's in there. I'm not going to let other people do it either. I mean, yeah, you might want to, in that case, knock yourself out. So I've pinned into these arms, because these arms are going to be holding a lot of weight. These are just to put it in perspective, these are the guns that each arm is going to be holding. That's a solid chunk of resin there that weighs a lot. So what I've used is I've actually used a galvanized nail, which was the perfect size. It's super strong. That's going to hold it. Yeah, some of that Gorilla Weld and the galvanized nail. It's a bit messy, but you're never going to see it. It's very easy to keep clean. As soon as it's on there, you just, once it's glued on, you just wipe it off straight away, and then, you know, it's easy to clean up. I have covered the eagles just with some cut out plastic card, because it's just the alliance that my Titan's going to have. That's something you want to decide at the end, or at the very beginning, sorry. You know, not everyone's going to want to do that, but I did. Yeah, pretty straightforward. This is super strong now. It's all glued, it's rock solid, it's good for 150 kilos. That's all ready to go. So yeah, what I would say is, if you look at this part, so again, I've decided to take the Imperial Eagle off, which was quite a bit of work, and it's still not finished. You can still see, if you look at it very closely, the sanding marks. Now, the best way to sand this stuff is to use wet and dry sandpaper, and do it wet. Do it in the sink and do it wet, which stops the dust. So the nasty thing about this stuff is that it's so fine. The resin dust is so fine. It gets into your lungs and it'll fuck your lungs right up, and it'll get into everything. Like, it'll get into the carpet, it'll get into your clothes, and you have to wash them straight away. Otherwise, yeah, that stuff's all going in your lungs as soon as you take your mask off. So yeah, be aware that if you're using sandpaper on this stuff, just do it wet. Use a file, an emery file. Use your wet and dry sandpaper of varying coarsenesses. So this is 240, so I still need to get 400, 800, 1200 under there. And then it'll come up really nice and smooth. I've done it before on the Warhound Titan, and it worked really nicely. Yeah, wet sand, that's a pro tip. The other pro tip is to drill these things, you will need one of those rotary tool, a Dremel, an Ozito. Really, I've owned a Dremel. It cost a couple of $100 and it lasted 5 years. I've also owned the one that you buy at Aldi for $50, and that's lasted for 5 years as well, and that's actually still going. It fits all the same Dremel bits, so look, I wouldn't knock yourself out buying the expensive one. Get a cheap one and buy 5 of them. If they fuck out, buy 5 of them. It's still cheaper, and they work just as well. But wear a mask. Definitely you want to be wearing a mask. So at this point, we are doing the legs. So the legs, once you've gotten the torso, at this point where you know that when you put it together, you've got a fair idea how big it is, you know how much it's going to weigh, and when you get your legs roughly where you want them, blue tack them and pose it. So you know what it's going to look like, and you know that the leg pose that you've chosen is going to actually support the weight and the balance of this big heavy chunk of resin up top. I wouldn't even bother assembling the legs until you've got at least to this stage. Obviously keep all the panels separate because you'll want to paint them separately. You see I've got the head here. The head's all built. Again, I'm not going to be painting any of that in there. I'm not going to be pulling this off. If you are, then yeah, paint it at this stage. Certainly you'll need to, if you want to paint the lenses, you'll need to be painting all this separately anyway. Like I said, I'm going to prime all of this. I'm just going to leave it black though, because you're never going to see it. I'm never taking this off, but you want to be painting all these lenses before you chuck that guy on. Yeah. So the legs are a bit of a bastard. There are a lot of parts. This is the biggest issue that you will have so far. So the instructions are typically vague on this. But if we look at this, you want to basically be lining that guy and that guy. These are your slots that you want to be getting the support struts on. So you see you've got these support struts. What you want to do is you want to glue this front one first and sit it in there like that. And then glue this front one and sit it in there like that, making sure that when they're together, when they're seated, there's no gap, that this all lines up really nicely. Leave it, hold it for about 30 seconds while that glue sets on those ones, and then move around to the next one. Do this one at the back here. Sit that in there so that that one is seated perfectly, that front one is seated perfectly, and that back one is seated perfectly as well. Hold it in place, 30 seconds, making sure that it still stays where it's supposed to, and repeat. So then get this one, glue this one, then sit it back in there, holding it together, making sure that that gap there is spot on. So it's this gap that it is a bastard actually to do that. I found it really difficult, but it's done now. I've then marked off on one of them, on the other one, an X and an X on these panels, so I know that they go with this one that's got an X on it as well. So I've just scoured into a part that you're not going to see with a scalpel, just a cross, and I know that all the ones with a cross on it go together, and that there's less room for mistakes there. Building the feet. So if we have a look at this foot, I have got blue tack holding this guy together. You have all of these little pistons, these pistons, it is very, very important. See, they've only got a limited amount of travel. But these pistons, before you decide on your pose, you blue tack these bottom armor panels and these pistons in place to make sure that the movement you want from the leg is possible with the armor that you've got. You then build the leg. So pinning, this will all be pinned. I will be putting a pin, this is the foot pad, through here up into the shin, so through the bottom here into the socket there and up into the shin, and that'll be a 3mm brass rod. I will be having a slightly more challenging pose because, you know, life's not meant to be easy. Certainly isn't at the moment. Some prick ate a bat, so everyone's life's very difficult at the moment. So let's make it a bit more difficult by having I'm gonna have a raised back foot treading on one toe. There's still some stuff to do there, but yeah, look, that's shouldn't be too hard. Managed it with the Warhound, and it's worth doing. It looks good. This is a big, complicated, expensive model, and you want it to look really cool at the end. You don't want it to just. I really don't like things that are just standing there. You know, 2 guns out the front. That's my personal taste anyway. A lot of people do like that, and I've seen some and I think, wow, that's really cool. But for me, I want something that looks like it's moving. It's going to crush some dudes. Yeah. Yeah, that's about it so far. So we've cleaned it. If you've bought one of these, you know that you need to clean it. You need to clean it really well. The way that I've done it is to soak it in just dishwashing liquid overnight. Then I scrub it with just a dish scrubber and then a toothbrush. You can use an electric toothbrush. That works really well too. I didn't use it for this one, but I've tested some of the leftover resin with primer. So you want to prime it and then test it. Make sure that it's clean, and test that the primer doesn't come off when you rub it. And yeah, this is all good. So I've soaked it overnight, scrubbed it with a big brush, scrubbed it with a small brush, then rinsed it under the tap in a big colander thing, which my wife was stoked about. I'm just kidding, I didn't tell her. And get all the soapy residue crap off, and then let it dry on a towel. I just sat it on a towel, not in the sun, because it's like 40 degrees in Australia, so you don't want to be melting this stuff. So just sit it out of the way, out of the sun. Maybe a fan, chuck a fan on it. I've done that in the past. Doesn't really matter, whatever. Leave it for a couple of days, let it sit. Then I've come back to it and sanded it. You can use to sand some of these bits off. I mean, some of the gates on this are huge. Like there's been a bit of slipping in this kit, but nothing too major. I'm not going to call them or send it back or anything. So you just have to work with it. But what I've used is one of those Azito Dremel style rotary tools to sand it down. If you are going to do that, make sure you wear a mask. It makes a lot of mess. Yeah, so where we're at now is legs. I'm going to assemble the legs with blue tack. The back leg is something I really need to work on. Once I get there, I think that's probably the point where we'll have another video. Yeah, if anyone's got any questions, suggestions, stuff that I've missed out on, chuck a comment down below. Yeah, nice one.